A headlamp is a lamp attached to the front of a vehicle to light the road ahead. While it is common for the term headlight to be used interchangeably in informal discussion, headlamp is the term for the device itself. While headlight properly refers to the beam of light produced and distributed by the device, headlamp performance has steadily improved throughout the automobile age, spurred by the great disparity between daytime and nighttime traffic fatalities. The U.S. National Highway Traffic Safety Administration states that nearly half of all traffic-related fatalities occur in the dark, despite only 25% of traffic traveling during darkness. Other vehicles, such as trains and aircraft, are required to have headlamps. Bicycle headlamps are often used on bicycles, and are required in some jurisdictions. They can be powered by a battery or a small generator. History of automotive headlamps. Mechanics. The earliest headlamps were fueled by acetylene or oil, and were introduced in the late 1880s. Acetylene lamps were popular because the flame is resistant to wind and rain. The first electric headlamps were introduced in 1898 on the Columbia electric car from the Electric Vehicle Company of Hartford, Connecticut, and were optional. Two factors limited the widespread use of electric headlamps: the short life of filaments in the harsh automotive environment, and the difficulty of producing dynamos small enough, yet powerful enough to produce sufficient current. Presto Light. Acetylene lights were offered by a number of manufacturers as standard equipment for 1904, and Peerless made electric headlamps standard in 1908. A Birmingham firm called Pockley Automobile Electric Lighting Syndicate marketed the world's first electric car lights as a complete set in 1908, which consisted of headlamps, side lamps and tail lights, and were powered by an 8-volt battery. In 1912, Cadillac integrated their vehicle's Delco electrical ignition and lighting system, creating the modern vehicle electrical system. Dipping headlamps were introduced in 1915 by the Guide Lamp Company, but the 1917 Cadillac system allowed the light to be dipped with a lever inside the car rather than requiring the driver to stop and get out. The 1924 Bilux bulb was the first modern unit, having the light for both low and high beams of a headlamp emitting from a single bulb. A similar design was introduced in 1925 by Guide Lamp called the Duplo. In 1927, the foot-operated dimmer switch or dip switch was introduced and became standard for much of the century. 1933 34 Packards were equipped with tri-beam headlamps, the bulbs having 3 filaments. From highest to lowest, the beams were called country passing, country driving, and city driving. The 1934 Nash also used a 3-beam system, although in this case, the bulbs were conventional 2-filament type, and the intermediate beam combined low beam on the driver's side with high beam on the passenger's side, so as to maximize the view of the roadside while minimizing glare toward oncoming traffic. The last vehicle with a foot-operated dimmer switch were the 1991 Ford F-Series and E-Series Econoline vans. Fog lamps were new for 1938 Cadillacs, and the 1954 Autronic Eye system automated the selection of high and low beams. Directional lighting was introduced in the rare, one-year-only 1935 Tatra 77A, and later popularized by the Citroën DS. This made it possible to turn the light in the direction of travel when the steering wheel was turned, and is now widely adopted technology. The standardized 7-inch round sealed beam headlamp was introduced in 1940, and was soon required for all vehicles sold in the United States, freezing usable lighting technology in place until the 1970s for Americans. Because the law was written to prevent bad headlights, it by design looks backwards and has historically not been able to deal with improved, innovative designs. In 1957, the law changed slightly, permitting Americans to possess vehicles with 4 5.75-inch round sealed beam headlamps, and in 1974, These lights were permitted to be rectangular as well. Clear aerodynamic headlight covers were illegal in the US until 1983, so a workaround was used for the US market. The pop-up headlight, Britain, Australia, and some other Commonwealth countries, as well as Japan and Sweden, also made extensive use of 7-inch sealed beams, though they were not mandated as they were in the United States. This headlamp format was not widely accepted in continental Europe, which found replaceable bulbs and variations in the size and shape of headlamps useful in car design. This led to different front-end designs for each side of the Atlantic for decades. Technology moved forward in the rest of the world. The first halogen lamp for vehicle headlamp use, the H1, was introduced in 1962 by a European consortium of bulb and headlamp makers. Shortly thereafter, headlamps using the new light source were introduced in Europe. These were effectively prohibited in the US, where standard-size sealed beam headlamps were mandatory and intensity regulations were low. US lawmakers faced pressure to act, both due to lighting effectiveness and vehicle aerodynamics, fuel savings. High beam peak intensity, capped at 140,000 candela per side of the car in Europe, was limited in the United States to 37,500 candela on each side of the car until 1978, when the limit was raised to 75,000. An increase in high beam intensity to take advantage of the higher allowance could not be achieved without a move to halogen technology, and so sealed beam headlamps with internal halogen burners became available for use on 1979 models in the United States. Halogen sealed beams now dominate the sealed beam market, which has declined steeply since replaceable bulb headlamps were permitted in 1983. High-intensity discharge systems were introduced in the early 1990s, first in the BMW 7 Series. European and Japanese markets began to prefer HID headlamps, with as much as 50% market share in those markets, but they found slow adoption in North America. 1996's Lincoln Mark 8 was an early American effort at HIDs, and was the only car with DC HIDs. Since U.S. headlight regulations continue to be different from the ECE regulations in effect in the rest of the world, the disputes over technological innovation continue today, including over automatic dimming technology, design and style beyond the engineering, performance and regulatory compliance aspects of headlamps. There is the consideration of the various ways they are designed and arranged on a motor vehicle. Headlamps were circular for many years, because that is the easiest shape for parabolic reflector manufacture. Headlamp styling outside the United States. Pre-1983 there was no requirement in Europe for headlamps of standardized size or shape, and lamps could be designed in any shape and size, as long as the lamps met the engineering and performance requirements contained in the applicable European safety standards. Rectangular headlamps were first used in 1961, developed by CBA for the Citroën AMI6 and by Hella for the German Ford Taunus. They were prohibited in the United States, where round lamps were required until 1975. Another early headlamp styling concept involved conventional round lamps fed into the car's bodywork with aerodynamic glass covers, such as those on the 1961 Jaguar E-Type, and on pre-1967 VW Beetles. Headlamp styling in the United States, 1940 to 1983. Headlight design in the U.S. changed very little from 1940 to 1983. In 1940, a consortium of state motor vehicle administrators standardized upon a system of two 7-in round sealed beam headlamps on all vehicles, the only system allowed for 17 years, a system of 4 round lamps, rather than 2, one high, low and one high beam 5 3/4 in sealed beam on each side, was introduced in 1957 by Cadillac, Chrysler, DeSoto and Nash on some of their car models in states that permitted the new system. Of these, the Nash Ambassador and the Cadillac Eldorado Brewer had quad headlights as standard equipment in 1957. Other American marques followed suit when all states permitted quad lamps in 1958. These lamps permitted more design flexibility. Auto stylists such as Virgil Exner carried out design studies with the low beams in their conventional outboard location, and the high beams vertically stacked at the center line of the car. No such designs reached volume production. Most cars had their headlights in pairs side by side on each side of the car, and some Oldsmobiles had a parking light in the middle of each pair. An example arrangement includes the stacking of two headlamps on each side with low beams above high beams. Nash used this arrangement in the 1957 model year. Pontiac used this design starting in the 1963 model year. American Motors, Ford, Cadillac and Chrysler followed 2 years later. Also in the 1965 model year, the Buick Riviera had concealable stacked headlamps. The Mercedes-Benz W100, W108, W111, and W112 models sold in America used this arrangement because their home market composite lamps were illegal in the U.S. The British firm Alvis and the French firm Facil Vega also used this setup for some of their cars, as did Nissan in Japan. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, Lincoln, Buick, and Chrysler arranged the headlamps diagonally by placing the low-beam lamps outboard and above the high-beam lamps. Certain British cars used a less extreme diagonal arrangement, with the inboard high-beam lamps placed only slightly lower than the outboard low-beam units. The 1965 Gordon Keeble, Jensen CV8, Triumph Vitesse and Bentley S3 Continental used such an arrangement. In 1968, when federal auto equipment and safety regulations were initiated, the requirement for 2 large or 4 small round sealed beams was codified, thus freezing headlamp design for many years. At the same time, the new regulations prohibited any decorative or protective element in front of the headlamps whenever the headlamps are switched on. Glass-covered headlamps, used on e.g. the Jaguar E-Type, pre-1968 VW Beetle, 1965 Chrysler and Imperial models, Porsche 356. Citroën DS and Ferrari Daytona were no longer permitted and vehicles had to be imported with uncovered headlamps for the U.S. market. This change meant that vehicles designed for good aerodynamic performance could not achieve it for the U.S. market. When Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 108 was amended in 1974 to permit rectangular headlamps, these were placed in horizontally arrayed or vertically stacked pairs. By 1979, the majority of new cars in the U.S. market were equipped with rectangular lamps. Again, the U.S. permitted only 2 standardized sizes of rectangular sealed beam lamp, a system of 2 200 by 142 mm high, low beam units corresponding to the existing 7-inch round format, or a system of 4 165 by 100 mm units. 2 high, low and 2 high beam, corresponding to the existing 5 3/4 in round format. International Headlamp Styling, 1983, present in 1983, granting a 1981 petition from Ford Motor Company. The 44-year-old U.S. headlamp regulations were amended to allow replaceable bulb, non-standard shape, architectural headlamps with aerodynamic lenses that could for the first time be plastic. This allowed the first U.S. market car since 1939 with replaceable bulb headlamps, the 1984 Lincoln Mark 7. These composite headlamps were sometimes referred to as Euro headlamps, since aerodynamic headlamps were common in Europe. Though conceptually similar to European headlamps with non-standardized shape and replaceable bulb construction, these headlamps conform to the SAE headlamp standards of U.S. Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard 108. and not the internationalized European safety standards used outside North America. Nevertheless, this change to U.S. regulations largely united headlamp styling within and outside the North American market. In the late 1990s, round headlamps returned to popularity on new cars. These are generally not the discrete self-contained round lamps as found on older cars, but rather involve circular or oval optical elements within an architecturally shaped housing assembly. Hidden headlamps. Hidden headlamps were introduced in 1936, on the Cord 810-812. They were mounted in the front fenders, which were smooth until the lights were cranked out, each with its own small dash-mounted crank, by the operator. They aided aerodynamics when the headlamps were not in use, and were among the Cord's signature design features. Later hidden headlamps require one or more vacuum-operated servos and reservoirs, with associated plumbing and linkage, or electric motors, gear trains and linkages to raise the lamps to an exact position to assure correct aiming despite ice, snow and age. Some early hidden headlamps, such as those on the Saab Sonett 3, used a lever-operated mechanical linkage to raise the headlamps into position. During the 1960s and 1970s, many notable sports cars used this feature, such as the Chevrolet Corvette, Ferrari Berlinetta Boxer and Lamborghini Countach, as they allowed low bonnet lines but raised the lights to the required height. But since 2003, no modern volume-produced car models use hidden headlamps, because they present difficulties in complying with pedestrian protection provisions added to international auto safety regulations regarding protuberances on car bodies to minimize injury to pedestrians struck by cars. Some hidden headlamps themselves do not move, but rather are covered when not in use by panels designed to blend in with the car's styling. When the lamps are switched on, the covers are swung out of the way, usually downward or upward, for example on the 1992 Jaguar XJ220. The door mechanism may be actuated by vacuum pots, as on some Ford vehicles of the late 1960s through early 1980s, such as the 1967-1970 Mercury Cougar, or by an electric motor as on various Chrysler products of the middle 1960s through late 1970s, such as the 1966-1967 Dodge Charger.